Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you for selecting my video. In today's video, we'll be focusing on a topic that is a mystery to many beginning sourdough bread bakers, and that is the idea of underproofing and overproofing of your dough. As a beginning sourdough bread baker, this is one of the most difficult and challenging aspects of understanding the recipe and the impact that the recipe has on the final outcome of your bread. So what we'll be doing today is a unique experiment where we'll be baking 4 different loaves of sourdough bread, and in each one of those 4 loaves, we'll be slightly varying the bulk fermentation time and the final proofing time, and we will be assessing what are the impacts of small changes in those times on the final outcome of the bread as it's baked. The way that we'll be doing this experiment is that we'll be following the standard, what's called the Basic Country Loaf recipe in the Tartine bread book by Chad Robertson. If you're not familiar with this recipe or this process, I recommend that first you watch my other 5-part video, The Sourdough Journey, Beginner Mistakes and Tips. That video goes through the entire tartine bread making process from start to finish in great detail. So I recommend you watch that first and then come back and watch this video once you're familiar with that process and want to do a deeper dive on these 2 specific areas, bulk fermentation and final proofing. So the way that we're going to do this is that we will bake 4 loaves of bread, and the variables that we will change will be the bulk fermentation time, which is recommended in the recipe to be between 3 and 4 hours, and the final proofing time, which is also recommended to be 3 to 4 hours, assuming that you're doing the same day bake version of the recipe, not the overnight proofing version of the recipe. So let me clarify this first before we go into the details. There are 2 different ways to follow the Basic Country Loaf recipe in the Tartine bread book. In my other video, we follow what's called the overnight proof or cold retard process, where after final shaping of your dough, you put it in the refrigerator for 8 to 12 hours and then you bake it the next day. There's a different version of the recipe, which is the same day bake, where instead of the overnight proof, we do a countertop proof for 3 to 4 hours and then we bake the loaves the same day. That is the method that we'll be using for today's experiment, is the same day bake with the countertop proofing. If you're interested in the overnight proofing method, I'll do another video where we look at that option. But for today's version, all 4 of these loaves will be using the same day bake method. So for the 4 loaves, what we'll be varying is the bulk fermentation time and the final proofing time, as I mentioned. And the reason that this is challenging for beginners is because the tartine bread recipe, like many other recipes, it gives ranges for how long these 2 processes should take. So when you're presented as a beginner with a recipe that says bulk fermentation should take 3 to 4 hours, your question is, well, 3 to 4, what does that mean? Should I do it for 3 hours, or should I do it for 4 hours, or should I do it for 3.5 hours? So until you become an experienced baker, it's incredibly frustrating and incredibly challenging to deal with the ambiguity of some of these recipes that provide a range. So what we'll be doing today is experimenting with the different extreme ends of the range to see what the impact is on the final outcome of your loaf. So we'll do this by creating 4 different loaves and varying the bulk fermentation time between 3 and 4 hours and the final proofing time between 3 and 4 hours. And then one of the 4 loaves will even go outside of the 4-hour recommendation on both of those, and we'll go up to 5 hours of bulk fermentation and 5 hours of final proofing to see what impact that would have. So when you think about changing all these variables, this sounds incredibly complicated. So the way that I'll lay this out is we'll bake these 4 different loaves, and think of these as 4 different scenarios that you might see if you decided to bake a loaf on a Saturday, for example. We're going to start all 4 of these loaves at 8 a.m. They're going to follow the same process for all the steps except for bulk fermentation and final proofing, which are the only 2 variables that we will change. And these 4 loaves could be described as follows. The first one is what I would call the as soon as possible loaf. In this example, we'll be basically looking at the ranges of times that are recommended and we need to get this loaf done as soon as possible, so we're going to pick the shortest end of the range recommended. So that would mean 3 hours of bulk fermentation and 3 hours of final proofing, and we'll see how that loaf comes out if we do what I call the as soon as possible loaf. That one from start to finish takes 10 hours, and in all these times that I'm giving, I've added in 90 minutes at the end to ensure that we allow the loaf to cool. So this one would start at 8 a.m., 10 hours later, this would be done at 6 p.m. The second loaf that we'll do is what I will call the dinner party loaf. So this is a Saturday where you have people coming for dinner, and you want to be cutting into a cooled but slightly warm loaf of your home-baked sourdough bread at exactly 7 p.m. So what we're going to do in this example is we'll start this one at 8 o'clock. We'll do 3 hours of bulk fermentation. That'll be in the morning. But then we're going to do 4 hours of final proofing, because you want to let this dough sit in the afternoon while you're making other preparations. And then this one will be ready at exactly 7 p.m. That's an 11-hour process with the 3 hours of bulk and the 4 hours of final proofing. The third example that we will do is what I would call the slow and easy loaf. This is where you have no time constraints, you have no commitments, you have all the time in the world. So we're going to follow the recipe, but we're going to pick the long end of all the ranges and basically make this loaf as slow as possible without going outside of the recommended times. So that would mean 4 hours of bulk fermentation and 4 hours of final proofing. This is basically a 12-hour loaf. We'll start this at 8 o'clock in the morning. This would be ready to eat at 8 p.m. And then the fourth loaf that we will do in this example is what I call the delayed loaf. So this is where reality sets in, life happens, you're not able to be home, or you're not able to move the dough along at the recommended times. So we're going to exceed the recommended bulk fermentation time of 4 hours and actually go 5 hours on bulk fermentation. And we will exceed the final proofing time maximum recommendation of 4 hours, and we'll do 5 hours of final proofing. And we'll really start to push the envelope and say, when do I really start to overproof my bread? What does that look like? And is that what happens if I start to exceed both of these times by 1 hour? So that's basically a 14-hour process where, again, we'll start at 8 a.m. with all the other loaves, and that one would be ready to go at 10 p.m. 14 hours later. So that's the process that we're going to follow. We'll do these 4 loaves, varying the bulk fermentation time and the final proofing time, with the purpose of this experiment to be, let's look at these loaves at the end of the process. We have a 10-hour loaf, an 11-hour loaf, a 12-hour loaf, and a 14-hour loaf. And we'll cut these open at the end and say, based on these small variations in bulk fermentation and final proofing time, what was the impact on the final bake? Did the loaves look different? Did they taste different? What did the crumb look like? What does the crust look like? What does the oven rise look like? So we'll do a very controlled experiment here so that we can really accelerate the learning to see the impact of changes in these times. Because as I said, this is one of the most frustrating and mysterious parts of following the process as a beginner. And the challenge that a lot of beginners have with learning is that we're only baking once a week or once a month. And you're changing a variable, you're changing one of these variables, and you look at your loaf and you're like, oh my gosh, I overproofed. And then you change another variable 2 weeks later and you're like, oh no, I underproofed. And then 2 weeks later you change something else and you're like, I overproofed again. And this is a really inefficient kind of trial and error method to really learn what the impact is of these two really critical parts of the process, bulk fermentation and final proofing. So that's the reason that we're focusing on these today. And I hope this works, and I hope that it turns out to be an educational experiment for all of us. I'm also trying this for the first time myself today. So what I've done off camera is basically started the process. If you want to see the first few steps in the process, you can watch my other video. It goes through them in detail, and I followed the exact same process here. What I did was I made the leaven last night. I added 200 grams of leaven to the water, 700 grams of water, 1,000 grams of flour, which is divided up between 900 grams of red flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. We mix all of that together. We let it sit for 40 minutes. That's called the auto-lease or ferment-to-lease process. Then we added salt, and that's where I am in the process right now. So basically I've mixed the dough, I've added the salt. It's been sitting here a total of about an hour. And now we're moving on to the stretch and fold process. I'll be doing 4 stretch and folds starting now. So we'll do one at 9 o'clock, one at 9:30, one at 10 o'clock, and one at 10:30. So this is the standard process of the stretch and folds with 30-minute breaks over the next hour and a half. Again, I'll do these off camera if you want to see how to do the stretch and fold process. That's covered in great detail in part 3 of my other 5-part video, The Sourdough Journey. So we'll catch up back here after I finish the 4th stretch and fold, and we will be 1.5 hours into the bulk fermentation process at that time. Okay, it's 10:30. I'm doing stretch and fold number 4. So just to catch you up on what I've done here is we're doing 4 stretch and folds with 30-minute intervals. First one was at 9 o'clock. Second was at 9:30. Third was at 10 o'clock. Fourth is at 10:30. So we're right on schedule. We're an hour and a half into bulk fermentation, and I'm doing the 4th stretch and fold. Again, you can watch my other video for details exactly on how we do this. Reach down to the bottom, pull it over the top. This looks really nice. This is it's a soft, kind of billowy, warm texture. It's keeping these indentations where I'm reaching in there with my fingers. That's a good sign that we're building gluten. It's puffed up a little bit. It's pulling away from the sides of the vessel and keeping more of a contiguous ball of dough in the middle. So that looks pretty good. That's our 4th stretch and fold. That's all we're going to do for this batch. The recipe gives you the option to do more after this. I guess one thing we could do while we're here is do a pull window pane test. So the way we do this is we just grab the edge of the dough and we pull it up, stretch, 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 and we see if the dough is translucent, and it is. I don't know if you can see it on the video, but I can see through this dough. I can see daylight through it. It rips a little bit on the edges because I'm using whole wheat in the recipe, and the wheat bran actually will cut through the gluten strands, but I'm getting really good stretching here, really thin. That's like a totally translucent skin. I can see through that. So that's a sign that we have good gluten development. I don't need to overhandle this a lot. The recipe calls for 4 stretch and folds. Some people do 5. Sometimes you look at it at this point, it feels like you need to do 1 more because the window pane doesn't quite give you that elasticity. But we're just going to follow the recipe strictly with 4 this time around. So this is the point where we are going to diverge into our 4 different loaf processes. So what have we done so far? Did the leaven last night, did the auto-lease / ferment-to-lease this morning. Now we're into bulk fermentation, 90 minutes, 4 stretch and folds. So let's just check where we are in terms of temperature. I've been measuring the dough temperature constantly through this whole process. It's incredibly important to measure your dough temperature through the entire bulk fermentation process. Our target temperature that we want is between 78 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 25.7 to 27.5 degrees Celsius. I've been running at internal dough temperature of right about 80 degrees, so right in the middle of that range, so that's been good. I'm keeping the dough in my oven with the light turned on. I use that as a proofing chamber. And again, in my other video, I go through this in tremendous detail. The internal temperature of the oven is about 86 degrees right now. I try to keep it around 85 with the light on in there. That gives me a nice, warm environment. I've been running roughly 79, 80 degrees. On this last turn, my temperature is now up to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm a little bit over our target that we wanted to be at. So I'm not going to put this back into the oven for additional proofing. And again, I don't have the heat turned on. I just have a light on, the oven light turned on in there. So we're 90 minutes through bulk fermentation. And now we're gonna break this into our 4 separate recipes going forward. So for our 4 separate recipes going forward, I'm going to divide this dough into 4 smaller containers because we're going to change the balance of the bulk fermentation time. So we're an hour and a half in. It calls for anywhere from 3 to 4 hours of bulk fermentation. I'm going to do one of these at 3 hours, 2 at 4 hours, and 1 at 5 hours, and we'll see what the difference is. So this is not going to be a pretty process because this dough is so sticky, and normally you wouldn't want to be handling and cutting the dough and all that, but in the interest of science, we're going to take some liberties here, and I'm going to divide this up as close as I can to equally. I'm not going to weigh this, I'm just going to eyeball it, because these don't need to be exactly the same sized loaves, and just weighing it would cause more handling of the dough, which I don't really want to do. So I'm cutting this. I'm using a bench scraper / bench knife, very handy tool that we'll need later. And this recipe, the tartine recipe, we started with 1,000 grams of flour, which typically makes 2 large-sized loaves or boules. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting this into 4. So we're actually going to make 4 half-sized loaves. These are essentially, instead of the 500-gram flour weight loaf that you normally get 2 of those out of the tartine recipe, we're going to get 4 half-sized loaves. I've made these before. They work really well, and I can do 4 at once off of this recipe. So I'm just going to dump these into our 4 containers carefully. Incredibly sticky. Trying to get those down into the vessel. Don't let them touch each other like I just did. 3 and 4. Okay, so going forward, we have 4 different recipes that we're going to be following here going forward. So I'm going to let these settle down into these containers a little bit. I'm going to pause the video, and then we'll come back and we're going to mark each one of these containers with the current height so that we can measure how much rise we're getting in each one of these going forward. Because in addition to the bulk fermentation time, there's also guidance on the percentage increase that you should see in the dough. So we'll talk about that when I come back momentarily. Okay, so I've just tapped these down a little bit to level them, and they're almost exactly the same weight. I actually did weigh these, and they're roughly 500 grams of dough in each one of these 4 tubs. And I've put a rubber band on each one so that we can measure how much these rise over time. So what I'm going to do now, we're in the middle of bulk fermentation. Normally we wouldn't be doing this step. We would have just, after stretch and fold, would have left these to rise. I'm just going to quickly measure the dough temperature again, not because these have been exposed to the room temperature by cutting and dumping. These are still good. These are 82.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a great temperature. So I'm going to leave these on the countertop now. I'm not going to put those back in the proofing chamber, which is my oven with the light on. And we're going to let these sit. I'll check back in every 30 minutes and see what these are doing in terms of rising. I have been checking the temperature of the 4 tubs of dough every half hour, and they've been running at roughly 81 to 82 degrees dough temperature, which is a good temperature that we want to be at for bulk fermentation. It was running in the same range for the first 90 minutes when we were doing stretch and fold. It's continuing in that range, so I'm really just letting these go. It's 11:30 a.m., so we've been in bulk fermentation now for 2.5 hours. The recipe calls for, on the low end, 3 hours of bulk fermentation, where we should see the dough rise by at least 20%. I'm just looking at where these are relative to the rubber band. We're up maybe 10%, but we're not at 20 by far. And we want to get this first loaf, the ASAP, as soon as possible loaf, moving on at the end of the 3-hour recommended bulk fermentation time. So I've been letting these sit on the countertop. They're roughly 81 degrees. I'm going to move these back into my oven for the last 30 minutes. The temperature won't change a lot in 30 minutes because the dough temperature is really slow to change, but these are relatively thin-walled containers that I normally don't use with this thin plastic. So this dough may approach room temperature quicker than it would if it was in the heavy glass container that I normally use. So just to keep these going, I'm going to put these back into my proofing chamber, which is my oven with the light on, for another 30 minutes, and then we'll check back in. Okay, it's noon. We've just finished 3 hours of bulk fermentation. That includes the first 90 minutes, which was stretch and fold, and the second 90 minutes, which was sitting on the countertop for most of that time. And then the last half hour of that 90 minutes, I put these back into my proofing chamber, which is the oven with the light on. So 3 hours is the minimum recommended time for bulk fermentation under the Tartine recipe. At the end of the bulk fermentation, we should see 20% rise in the dough. So now I'm going to remove these covers and see where we are. We'll just do this for our first 2 recipes. If you remember, number 1, this is my as soon as possible recipe. We're going to try to get this done as quickly as we can. And the second one, this is my 7 p.m. dinner party. So I've got to keep moving on this one, or I'm going to miss my 7 p.m. cutting time. So these 2 were really pushing towards this end of the time range, the 3-hour time limit. So let me just see where we are. I look at my rubber band, it was at 6 centimeters. 20% increase should be 7.2 centimeters. We're roughly at 7.5. This one's almost at 8. So we're just barely at 20% increase in size on these, which meets the criteria of moving on to the next step. You can also look around the outside edge of these containers. There's a lot of activity. These are bubbling, they're fermenting. These will continue to move and continue to grow during the final proofing, which we're also going to do at room temperature. So because I'm in a rush, I say I'm at 20%, I'm at 3 hours, I got to move on these 2 loaves. This was my plan, 3 hours each. We're at exactly 3 hours, we're going to move forward. These 2, my longer bulk fermentation, this one, number 3, is going to go for 4 hours. Number 4 is going to go for 5 hours. I'm just going to let these sit. I tested the internal dough temperature. It's still running between 80 and 81 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 25 degrees Celsius. I'm not in any worry, any rush with these. I'm just going to let them go. I'm going to leave them on the countertop for now because they're still at a good temperature. They don't need to go back in the proofing box. These 2, I need to do my rough shaping and do a 30-minute bench rest. So I'm going to do that now. So when we do our rough shaping of the loaves, we dump this out onto an unfloured surface. And again, all of these details are in my other video. If you're really interested in the technique and all that, I recommend watching the other one. Here I'm really just flying through the process so that we can focus on the variations of the time, not all of the individual steps. So I carefully pour this out into a gob. Came out cleanly, which is a good sign. And for these 4 loaves, again, these are half-sized loaves. So these are 250 grams of flour weight. And I'm going to, instead of making the round boule shape, I'm actually going to make these in oblong pans just because I have these little loaf pans that I'm going to use for shaping. So these will be what's called the batard shape. B-A-T-A-R-D. It's like between an oval and a rectangle. So what do? We lightly flour the surface. We're establishing the top and the bottom of what will be the loaf. You don't want to get flour on the bottom. I'm just going right up to the edge here, and I'm trying to keep a lot of flour off of my work surface because I don't want to accidentally get it on the bottom. I'm rubbing this in a little bit because I'm creating that surface, which is going to be the crust. Kind of shape that into something of a circle. Very carefully, you don't want to degas the loaf. You don't want to push the air bubbles out. Then I flip this over. So now my floured side is down, my unfloured side is up. And what I want to do now is just carefully fold this on itself to start to build some surface tension. I'm folding, grabbing and folding. I'm stretching the dough to build surface tension. This is my sticky side. I don't want flour on my sticky side because I want this to seal up tightly eventually. I flip this back over, and now I start to shape this just into a round. By using the bench scraper, I'm pushing the dough under and turning gently, carefully. It's very sticky. Just trying to build surface tension. That means stretching the skin on the top. That's what's meant by surface tension. So I'm using the front edge of this to just grab the sticky part on the bottom of the loaf and pushing it towards the center. So it's like stretching a balloon. Very sticky. I just need a little flour here. You don't want to introduce a lot of flour at this point. That one's pretty good. And then that's going to sit. Let's do our second one. At some point, you're doing more harm than good. Okay, loaf number 1, loaf number 2. These sit for 30 minutes. Okay, it is 12:30, so we have been letting our rough shaped loaves bench rest for 30 minutes as is called for in the recipe. Now we're ready to do the final shaping on loaves number 1 and 2. Move this one aside briefly. Okay, so this is loaf number 1. We're going to do our final shaping. As I mentioned, this will be a batard shape. And you can see in that 30-minute bench rest, this relaxed a little bit. That's typical. It spread out a little bit. That's exactly what we would expect it to do. This looks like a pretty good loaf based on where we are right now. So when we do final shaping, we're going to flip this over. And similarly, we don't want to handle this too much. I'm going to stretch this into somewhat of a rectangular shape. And again, in my other video, we go through this final shaping process in great detail, so I'm going to do this fairly quickly. We fold the bottom third up. We stretch the two sides out, fold those over themselves, grab the top, pull that sticky side over, and that seals the whole package. We roll it onto itself, really tighten that up to build that surface tension. So that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to flip this over, check the bottom. We really want all these seams sealed up, or else you'll get some odd shaping as steam rushes in through these seams. So I just go around and kind of pinch these seams together. So that's upside down right there. And that goes into our shaping basket, upside down, meaning the top side down. Now this loaf number 1, we did bulk fermentation of 3 hours, and then this will do a countertop final proof of 3 hours. The target temperature for this step is 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roughly 24 to 26.6 degrees Celsius. My current room temperature is about 76 degrees. It's a little warm in here. So I'm just going to let these sit on the countertop. I'll cover them with these plastic elastic food wraps. They'll keep their dough temperature for a while. So that's number 1 is done. Number 2. That's a pretty good loaf. Goes in the shaping basket. Now this is my second loaf. This is for my 7 p.m. dinner party loaf, so I have a little bit more time to let this loaf go. So this had 3 hours of bulk fermentation, but for final proofing on the countertop, we will let this one go for 4 hours versus the rush loaf, which is 3 hours. So we have a 3-hour countertop proof and a 4-hour countertop proof going side by side. So let's check in on our other 2 loaves. This was loaf number 3. This is our slow and easy loaf, no rush. That's still got another half hour to go on bulk fermentation. And then number 4, this is our delayed loaf. We're out of the house, we're not even around, we don't know what's happening with this one. This one's actually going to go for a total of 5 hours of bulk fermentation. So that's still got another hour and a half to go. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. So our third loaf, number 3, this is our slow and steady loaf where we're just going at the maximum recommended times. This has been in bulk fermentation for 4 hours. If you recall, the recommended time for bulk fermentation is 3 to 4 hours. The guidance is that it should rise by 20% based on where our rubber band is here. We're over 20%. I'll just give that a quick measurement. And we're up about I'd say 35 to 40% increase. So this is well on its way. We're done with bulk fermentation on loaf number 3. So now I'll pour this onto the countertop here and do the rough shaping. So if we just look at this dough, this is the 4-hour bulk fermentation. It's definitely a little larger than the 3-hour bulk fermentation loaves. Came out this is mounded up a little bit more. It's a little airier, a little more billowy looking. So we're going to flour this. It's standing up a little higher off the countertop. So you can definitely see the effect of roughly, let's call it 40% increase in size versus the first loaves, which were just the minimum of 20% increase in size. So we will flip this over and do our rough shaping where we're really just folding the loaf onto itself. This is a much looser dough. I'm not getting any resistance really. Pulling this back, it's a puffier ball. So that's my bottom. I don't want flour on the bottom. Flip this back over. You can see this is larger than the prior loaves that we had. Definitely more air in this loaf. And now we want to build that surface tension by pressing the bottom against the blade of the bench scraper. I'm stretching. You can see the skin of the crust really stretching. This is a really nice looking loaf. This looks a little better to me than the prior 2. It's just much puffier, standing up much prouder. I'm getting good surface tension on it. It's a little less sticky, a little bit easier to work with. There we are. So that's our rough shaped loaf. This is going to bench rest for 30 minutes now. Okay, it's 1:30 and we have been letting our loaf number 3 bench rest for 30 minutes. So this is ready for final shaping. You can see by this loaf, it's definitely a little larger than the prior 2 loaves, which only did bulk fermentation for 3 hours. This has been, had gone for 4 hours. So there's definitely more fermentation, more CO2 activity in this loaf. It's standing up a little taller. It didn't flatten out as much as the other loaves. So just looking at these on the surface from bulk fermentation, this one looks like a little bit better looking loaf based on my experience. So now we will flip the floured side down, stretch this out a little bit. This is definitely puffier in the middle. It's a little bit taller, if you want to call it that. And we stretch and fold our bottom third. This is actually has a little bit more tensile strength. It's pulling back against me a little bit more than the prior ones. So there's more gluten development in this typically. I grab the top, roll that over, and tighten up that package. Then I tighten the ends. Pinch those closed. Fold this over. It's our bottom. Pinch the seams. You can see this is much more billowy. Looks more like a pillow compared to the prior two. So this has a lot more activity going on in it than the prior two. You can also see many more bubbles pushing up against the surface, the skin. So that's our third loaf going into its shaping basket. And that one's good to go. So this one will now do a bench rest countertop proofing for 4 hours. So we did 4 hours of bulk fermentation, and we're going to do 4 hours of countertop proofing. So this one is really getting 8 hours of essentially fermentation time. This one will likely really puff up. Okay, it's 2 o'clock and we are on our 4th loaf, bulk fermentation. This is our delayed loaf. This is where you could imagine we started bulk fermentation, something came up, we had to leave. The time recommended for this process is 3 to 4 hours, and we're actually sitting at 5 hours. We just couldn't get back in time to do the next step. So this is 5-hour bulk fermentation. This one has risen about a little over 50%. I'm going to say about 55% growth in this. So not a lot more than the loaf that went for 4 hours. So this might really be maxing out in terms of what you would get out of bulk fermentation after 5 hours, which is quite a long time. I'm also on this one, now that we're done with bulk fermentation after this one, I'm just going to take the internal dough temperature here. I've had this sitting on the countertop, and our target range for bulk fermentation is 78 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 25.5 Celsius to 27.7 Celsius. And this is sitting right at about 79 degrees. So that's a good temperature, good bulk fermentation temperature. The reason I test that is because if the temperature were below 78, then that means you need to add more time to bulk fermentation. If it's above 82 or pushing 82, you take time away from bulk fermentation. We remained right in that target range between 78 and 82 through the entire process. So these are representative of kind of an average bulk fermentation at the appropriate temperature. You can also see as I shake this one, this is really loose and jiggly. That's a good sign that there's a lot of air building up inside of that one. So now let me pour this out onto our unfloured countertop, and we will do rough shaping of loaf number 4. Okay, this is on our countertop now. Similarly to the other one, much larger in size because there's just been more fermentation activity, more CO2 building up inside the loaf. You can see how tall this is standing up. That is really a proud piece of dough, standing up 2.5 inches or so off of the countertop. So first we just roughly shape this into something kind of round. We smooth the surface out. I'm getting that flour really on the sides, but you don't want flour underneath. I get it on the sides just so I can pick this up to flip it, but you want to keep the bottom sticky. Just patting that so you can see how much air is in that loaf. There's a lot in there. That looks really good. So we flip this over and then we pull and fold. This loaf is very loose compared to the others. I'm getting almost no resistance. So that means we're really pushing the bulk fermentation to the limit, where this loaf is not really able to hold its shape if it goes much longer than this in terms of the bulk fermentation. So I'm doing a little bit extra folding on this because it's not giving me any resistance. So I need to pull to create a little more surface tension on this loaf. And we flip this over and we use this technique of pushing with the bench scraper while we're turning the loaf. And we're doing two things: building surface tension and sealing the bottom. So you can see I'm pushing that skin, pushing and stretching. That looks pretty good right there. Try to keep the round shape. Okay, that loaf looks pretty good. That sits and bench rests for 30 minutes now. Okay, it's 2:30 p.m., so we're doing the final shaping of loaf number 4. If you recall, this was our delayed loaf where we did 5 hours of bulk fermentation. So this is our last step before proofing this loaf. I just add a little flour again to the top, smooth that out. Flip that over. So similar to our prior loaf, this is really puffed up. There are a lot of air bubbles right under the surface. You can see them coming up through the skin. I'm just gonna try to pop some of those out because you don't want those giant bubbles right on the surface like that. That'll impact your crust. Yeah, this is really puffed up. A lot of air bubbles, a lot of activity. So we'll see what happens with this. This one went 5 hours against the guidance of 3 to 4. We just seal up our seams on the bottom. We have our shaping basket prepared with rice flour. That loaf is good to go. You can see if I just shake this, how loose that loaf is. That's really pushing the limit on bulk fermentation when the loaf is that loose. Okay, we're getting ready to bake loaf number 1. This was our fast loaf that we accelerated through the process. So we did 3 hours of bulk fermentation and 3 hours of countertop final proofing. So this one is ready to go into the oven. It is 3:30 p.m. The second loaf, we did 3 hours of bulk fermentation. We're going to let this one go for another hour of countertop final proofing. So this will be 3 plus 4, 7 hours total. This one we went for 4 hours. Loaf number 3 went for 4 hours on bulk fermentation, and this will go for 4 hours on the countertop final proof. And the last loaf went for 5 hours of bulk fermentation and will go for 5 hours on the countertop. You can just see by shaking these, the ones that went longer in bulk fermentation are much, much looser loaves. This one's in a little bit bigger pan, so it spread out a little bit more. This one's definitely loose, and this one's a little stiffer. So loaf number 1, we dust with a little rice flour to keep it from sticking. This is the bottom of the loaf. If you remember, we put these in upside down. Now we're ready to score loaf number 1. So what I do is put a piece of parchment over this, flip it out, carefully remove the shaping basket, which happens to be a pan. Carefully remove the towel. That one stuck a little bit. Then I just scrape these big clumps of rice flour off of the loaf. And then these are batards, which are kind of these long ovals. I'm not going to do decorative scoring on these. I'm just going to keep this simple, and I'm going to score these straight down the middle with a deep score that goes all the way to the bottom over there. And as I mentioned, these really stick a little bit. There we go. So that is ready to go in the oven. You can see as soon as I scored that, this loaf really starts to flatten out and open up. That's what happens when you do the same day bake, where you're not doing the overnight proofing in the fridge. If we had proofed this in the fridge, it would stand up a little bit more. So you need to work pretty quickly with these. Okay, I just took loaf number 1 out of the oven. Let's take a look at it. So this was loaf number 1. If you recall, this was 3 hours of bulk fermentation and 3 hours of countertop final proofing. This baked for 20 minutes with the lid on at 450, 20 minutes with the lid off. And then let's see what we have here. The first thing that I notice is just this tremendous oven spring, this really, puffed up. We got a beautiful ear here along the scoring. We got the blistering around the edges, not quite as much blistering as I've seen on some other loaves. The bottom is perfectly done. Sounds hollow, did not burn. So that's a really nice looking loaf. The color, you can see this has a really kind of dark brown color with this golden strip down the middle. The dark brown color means that more of the sugars came to the surface of the crust here during the countertop final proofing. And this little kind of burnt edge on the ear, that's all the sugars right on the edge there as well. That's really a beautiful loaf. We're just going to let that cool now for 90 minutes. This was our as soon as possible loaf, so we started this at 8 o'clock this morning. It's 4:15, 4:20 right now. That needs to rest about 90 minutes until it's fully cool before I would recommend cutting into it. So that would be at roughly 5:45, 5:50 p.m. That's about as fast as you can make one of these loaves, somewhere between 9.5 and 10 hours. Okay, it is 4:30. It's time to score and bake loaf number 2. So let's look at our 3 loaves that are still doing our countertop proofing. So these all look pretty similar. Loaf number 2, this one we did 3 hours of bulk fermentation and 4 hours on the countertop. Loaf number 3, we did 4 hours of each bulk fermentation and 4 hours on the countertop. And loaf number 4, we did 5 hours of bulk fermentation, and this is maybe 3 hours through its countertop proof. The loaves all look pretty similar. If I shake them, you can see they still have a lot of flexibility, a lot of airiness in them. You see more bubbles on the surface of these two than the first one, so this implies there's a little bit less aeration inside, or at least it didn't come up to the surface as much as loaves number 3 and 4. So loaf number 2, this was our dinner party loaf. We started this at 8 a.m. and we want to be able to cut into this exactly at 7 p.m. So we're right on schedule for that. I flip this onto my parchment paper, remove the pan. See how this one is sticking a little bit? Not too bad. Not just a hair there. Okay. I scrape off the large areas of rice flour. You can see this is already flattening out quite a bit at room temperature once I take it out of the pan. And on this one, let's do what is called the poke test. So I'm just gonna put some flour on my fingertip. I'm gonna poke that loaf, and you'll see it comes back about halfway. that means that this is sufficiently proofed. That's a pretty good looking poke test where it goes down and then comes back part way. It still leaves some indentation after you're done. So let's score this one and get it in the oven. I'll do the same scoring here right from the bottom over the top. Just keep going, don't saw through it, don't stop. That's pretty good. Okay, loaf number 2 is going in the oven. Okay, loaf number 2 is done. I just took this out of the Dutch oven. Let's just brush off a little bit of the rice flour. This loaf looks really good. It looks very similar to the first loaf. The bottom got a little darker on this loaf, maybe because it's the second one that I've done back to back in that Dutch oven, so the bottom of that pan is heating up a little bit. But this one looks very similar to the first one. Very dark color, nice ear across the top, that golden ridge down the middle where it split open. On the outside, this looks very similar to the first loaf. Not a whole lot of difference here. This one, we did bulk fermentation for 3 hours and final proofing for 4 hours versus the first loaf, which was 3 and 3. So 1 extra hour on the countertop. Does not appear on the outside to be a huge difference. We'll see when we cut these open. Okay, loaf number 3 is ready to go in the oven. Here's the last 2 remaining, 3 and 4. These look pretty similar. Number 4 is a little larger. Number 3, this one had 4 hours of bulk fermentation and 4 hours of final proofing on the countertop. That's a nice looking loaf. This one's keeping its shape a little bit better. Didn't quite flatten out as much and as quickly as the one prior to it did. Just scrape a little bit of this off. And then we'll do our scoring, same as before, right down the middle. Yeah, this one has more air in it. It's even harder to score. Having a really tough time getting that blade through there. I just dipped that in a little water. Really tough to score this one. That is a very loose loaf. So this had 4 hours bulk fermentation, 4 hours on the countertops. That's 8 hours, really pushing the limits. That's the 2 outside limits for the 2 steps in the tartine process: bulk fermentation maximum of 4 and countertop proofing maximum of 4. So you can see what happens. This loaf tends to flatten out, get really airy. It's not bad. We'll see how it bakes up. Okay, loaf number 3 is out of the oven. I will carefully remove this from the Dutch oven. And we'll see what we have here. Very similar to the first 2. Let me just brush this off. Really nice, dark, caramelized color. That golden strip down the middle. Almost burned on the ear. The bottom looks really good. This one is not quite as dark on the bottom as the previous one. So let's compare this to the first 2. So this was loaf number 1. This is loaf number 2 and loaf number 3. These look very similar. I mean, almost impossible to tell the difference. If I didn't have these markers on these 2 loaves and I mixed these up, I don't know if I could really identify which was first, second, or third. So on the outside, these loaves are baking up almost exactly the same. So just to recap, The first loaf was 3 hours of bulk fermentation, 3 hours of final proofing on the countertop. The second loaf was 3 hours of bulk fermentation, 4 hours of final proofing on the countertop. And the third loaf was 4 hours of bulk fermentation and 4 hours of final proofing on the countertop. So basically 6 hours combined, 7 hours combined, 8 hours combined. They really look pretty similar. If you look at the top-down view, you can see that as we're moving up here progressively to the right, the loaves are flattening out and getting a little fatter. And that's because the loaves were losing their shape a little bit. The ones that had proofed a little bit longer start to lose their shape. So you can see a little bit of a difference here. This first loaf has a little bit more height from the oven spring that we saw. So as I look at these a little bit longer, it is a little bit more evident what is happening here is that the longer proofed loaves lose their shape a little bit, flatten out, are not quite as tall, just by a hair, and are a little bit fatter and wider. Okay, we are on our last loaf. This is loaf number 4. If you recall, this was what we called our delayed loaf, because this was the loaf where we blew through all the recommended times. The bulk fermentation time of 3 to 4 hours. We went 5 hours on bulk fermentation. And then for the countertop final proof, that was recommended 3 to 4 hours. And we went 5 hours on that as well. So total of 10 hours. So if any of our loaves are overproofed, this will be the one. Let's see where we are. We'll flip this out. Remove the towel. That actually still looks okay. It didn't flatten out like a pancake, which is a good sign. Let's do the poke test here. So I'll just poke this lightly with my finger, and that bounces back. See, now this one almost bounces back all the way. I just hit that twice. It's not bad. So it's still keeping some of the indentation coming back halfway. So there's not really evidence that this is overproofed based on how the dough is behaving. It just looks a little bit flatter than the other ones, and we'll see how it bakes up, and then we'll cut it open. So let me just score number 4. That blade really catches. This one's really tough to score. It's so soft. Okay, we'll get this in the oven. Okay, loaf number 4 is done. Let's take a look. So I pulled this out of the oven. Looks very similar to the others. Really nice dark brown crust. Just that little charring on the top of the ear. A little blistering around the edges, very similar to the other loaves. This one actually seemed like it was cooking a little faster than the others. So I took it out of the oven about 2.5 to 3 minutes sooner than the prior ones. So each one of these loaves baked for about 20 minutes with the lid on and 20 minutes with the lid off. The first loaf went about, I'd say, 21 minutes with the lid off. The second 2 went exactly 20 minutes with the lid off. And the third one went about 17 minutes with the lid off. And what happens with these loaves that have a little bit more of the proofing and bulk fermentation is that more of the sugars come to the surface, so they cook a little bit quicker, and the crust wants to burn a little bit quicker because it's a little more sugary in the crust. So if we look at the 4 loaves and compare them, really not a lot of discernible differences here. So we will cut these open and take a look at the inside, see what the crumb looks like. That's really the best way to tell if these were under or overproofed. It's very hard to tell just by looking at the outside of the loaves. And we will also taste them to see if there's a taste difference among the 4 loaves. Okay, all 4 of our loaves are done. We'll just do one last comparison here before I slice into them. So if you recall, this was our as soon as possible loaf, 3 hours bulk fermentation, 3 hours of proofing. The second one was our 7 p.m. target dinner party loaf. This was 3 hours of bulk fermentation, 4 hours of countertop final proofing. The third loaf was the maximum recommended time for both the bulk fermentation and final proofing, 4 hours each. And then the fourth loaf was where we exceeded the recommended time on both bulk and the final proof, and we went over by 1 hour each. So this was 5 hours of bulk fermentation and 5 hours of countertop final proof. On the surface, they don't look very different. The first loaf definitely stood up a little bit more. We had a little more pronounced oven spring on the top here. And then as we went through the 4 bakes, the color changed a little bit. These loaves 3 and 4 definitely had a little more caramelization of the crust, a little darker crust. The ear started to char a little sooner than the earlier loaves because more of the sugar comes out to the surface when you do the longer fermentation and proofing. This last loaf I actually took out of the oven 3 minutes sooner than all the prior loaves. These all went 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with the lid off at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, with the exception of the last one, which I took out 3 minutes earlier. This last loaf also had a blowout here. In addition to this deep score, it also blew through the crust here, so there was some additional pressure inside of that loaf. And you could also see that the shaping of the final 2 loaves flattened out a little bit. I lost a little bit of the tight oval shaping. So as you go through these and just look at the shaping, this one remained very tight, really as shaped. This one flattened out a little bit. This one flattened out and got a little misshapen. This corner bulged out here, this side bulged out there. And the last one, similarly, these 2 sides bulged out, this corner bulged out. So the longer proofing that you do, the more you're kind of sacrificing in terms of the ability of the loaf to retain its shape. That's a fairly subtle difference that you really wouldn't notice unless you really line these up side by side like that. So that's our assessment of the 4 loaves prior to cutting. So now let's cut into the loaves and see what they look like on the inside. So let's take a look at loaf number 1. So loaf number 1, this was our as soon as possible loaf. We really pushed the times on this to be as short as possible, 3 hours of bulk fermentation and 3 hours of countertop proofing. And this has the telltale signs of underproofing, that giant open tunnel that you see on the top of this side right here, the giant open tunnel. That's an indication of underproofing. This loaf is not horrible because the other sign of underproofing is you would see a very dense layer on the bottom and then all these giant air bubbles on the top. This actually opened up fairly nicely, and the texture of the crumb is actually quite airy, and you see these translucent edges or sides of the holes, which actually is an indication of fairly good proofing. So this is right on the edge. It was very close, other than that giant hole that appeared in there, that giant tunnel, a little bit on the underproofed side, but really not too bad. That's a pretty good looking loaf. The other thing to note is because these are half-size loaves, the holes that you're looking at are exaggerated. It's a little bit of an optical illusion because you're used to seeing the distribution of the holes in the crumb on a full-size loaf. So you also have to just kind of reset your mind and say, okay, this is half the size, so the holes are naturally going to look bigger relative to the size of the crust, but this one giant one is unmistakable. That would be a big hole on any size loaf. So that's loaf number 1. That's not too bad. Pretty pleased with that. So let's take a look at loaf number 2. Loaf number 2, if you recall, this was 3 hours of bulk fermentation, so the same as loaf number 1. But we did 4 hours of our countertop final proof, so this had 1 extra hour compared to the prior one. This was a total bake time of 11 hours, start to finish. All these bake times include 90 minutes of cooling at the end. So let's compare loaf number 2. So this one looks much better. You can see there's a better distribution of the holes. You don't have the giant tunnel through the middle. Fairly airy crumb. This still looks slightly on the underproofed side again because I see this kind of long row of a little bit more dense crumb at the bottom and a lot of the air holes up on the top and a little bit bigger, more like tunnels than actual bubbles, if you will. They're not like a circular, completely circular bubble. They're more like a tunnel. The tunnels are an indication that you had a lot of CO2 activity there rising up, which is an indication of slightly underproofing. But again, that is not a bad loaf at all. Number 2, I would be happy serving that at my 7 p.m. dinner party, and it came out right on time. So that's loaf number 2. So these are moving in the direction as you would expect from kind of the continuum of underproofing to overproofing. Let's take a look at loaf number 3. Okay, loaf number 3. This one looks excellent. Of all 3 that we've seen so far, this is by far the best looking one. You see a much more even distribution of the holes in the crumb, and you don't see the giant tunnels or the giant holes near the top of the crumb. Really noticeable difference between this loaf and the prior 2 loaves. That makes a lot of sense. So this one, we did 4 hours of bulk fermentation and 4 hours of the countertop proof. This one looks really good. If I had to, pick the best looking one so far, this is very nice. We also had the nice ear on there. You get the little bunny rabbit profile, which is desirable. I guess you do them this way because the bunnies are kissing now. So that's loaf number 3. Very nice crumb on number 3. And then loaf number 4. This one is our delayed loaf, where we missed our target time of maximum recommended time of 4 hours of bulk fermentation, 4 hours of countertop proofing. We blew through both of those by 1 hour. So we did 5 hours of bulk fermentation and 5 hours of the countertop final proof. That happens from time to time. Sometimes you just can't be around when you need to move the loaves through the schedule. We're going to see what happens with the extra proofing time on loaf number 4. This one is not bad, but not quite as good as number 3. So what you see here is we did have a more even distribution of holes in the crumb, similar to loaf number 3, but not loaf number 4. But what you see is these big air holes around the edges now, which means that the dough kind of took off on me. The dough, because there was so much air in here, the dough started to kind of do its own thing, and it just stretched out a little bit more and started to lose some of the structure. And what I mean by losing the structure is that because the gluten was starting to meet its kind of maximum point of extensibility and tensile strength, the whole loaf just starts to lose its structure. So then when you start to get the expansion of steam in the oven, the steam is going to go wherever it wants to go because the loaf can't hold it together. So this is just barely starting to push the edges of overproofing. I mean, if I saw a picture of this and you said, is this overproofed? Most people would say, no, that's a pretty good looking loaf. But relative to the other loaves, you can see that this is different because we're starting to get these big holes now around the edges. And unlike the first ones, the holes are not solely around the top edge. You see these holes around the bottom edges as well, which means that I lost that tensile strength. I lost that structure of the loaf a little bit, and it couldn't handle the steam in the oven. But this is just barely on the edge of overproofing. Again, if you asked 10 people, is this overproofed? 9 of them would say no. So that's another good looking loaf. And this one, we really blew through the times, both in terms of the bulk fermentation time, we went an hour extra, and the final proofing time, we went an hour extra. But it's not all about what the loaves look like. We also want to know what they taste like. So I started a little taste test here. So I just did a quick taste test of the Four Loaves. They're all very similar. I think the main difference is just comparing these same day bakes to the overnight retard, which we did not do in this recipe, but I do that in my other video. These are incredibly mild tasting. You don't really taste much of the sour flavor at all. These just have this beautiful light French country loaf flavor, which is the preferred flavor that Chad Robertson goes for in the tartine recipe. These are really fantastic if you want a mild flavor. Even comparing the combined 6 hours of bulk fermentation and proofing to a combined 10 hours, this 10-hour loaf is not significantly more sour tasting than the one that we fermented for 6 hours. You really don't start to get that real pungent sour taste until you start to get into the overnight cold retard or the overnight proofing in the refrigerator. So these are all very narrow, kind of within the taste profile. As I move from number 1 to number 4, what you do taste differently is particularly in this number 4, which we went for 5 hours on the bulk fermentation and 5 hours on the countertop proofing, is you taste the caramelization. There's definitely more sugar in the crust. The crust is a little bit thicker. The crust is a little bit darker. The ear is a little bit darker. So you're definitely tasting more of that sugary, caramelized flavor, particularly in that 4th loaf. The other 3, I have to say, were pretty indiscernible. If we rearranged these and took my number flags off of them and you asked me to do a taste test and put them in the order of 1 through 4, I probably couldn't tell the difference between 1, 2, and 3, but I probably could tell the difference between number 4. So how do we summarize what we've seen here? The first takeaway from this is just undeniable, is you have to give credit to the book. The recipe works. I mean, we followed this. It gives the ranges of 3 to 4 hours of bulk fermentation. 3 is just barely on the low end. 4 turned out a little bit more perfectly. If you start to go over 4, you start to see that the loaf loses some structure. So this is unbelievable validation that if you follow the recipe, in this book in particular, but I think a lot of these books, they work. These are tried and true methods. And if you really stick to the guidance, these are fairly reliable recipes. The second thing is that on the outside of the loaf, just by looking at the outside, it's very difficult to tell what's going on. These baked up incredibly similarly. I mean, I'm just looking at these now. If I mixed all these up and took my little numbered flags off of them, it would be nearly impossible for me to reassemble these just based on looking at the crust. So almost all of the impact of the bulk fermentation and proofing time is more evident on the inside of the loaf than the outside of the loaf. And then the third point is that the crumb followed exactly the pattern that we would have expected. Is number 1 showed the signs of underproofing with the giant tunnel in the middle. Number 2 showed a little bit less underproofing, smaller holes, but still those giant holes kind of riding up towards the top of the loaf, and a little bit more dense crumb towards the bottom of the loaf. Let me do these this way. Number 3, this was really kind of our sweet spot of all 3 loaves. That crumb looks perfect, a mix a kind of even distribution of small and large holes in the crumb. And then number 4, still really not bad, but you can see that the holes in the crumb are a little bit more erratic. Much bigger holes kind of around the edges, and a few of the medium-sized holes, and then some areas just of dense crust in the middle, because we started to overproof that a little bit. Again, I don't want to call loaf number 4 overproofed. Most people look at that and say it looks fantastic, but I'm being overly critical on myself. So that's a great comparison of the process and what happens, and I hope that you found this video helpful. I've tried to make these videos specifically for beginners because it just takes so much time to build up experience and be able to kind of read the dough and listen to the dough and these other things that experts say. And for beginners, you know, you really struggle. I struggle with that. So I try to do experiments like this to really kind of prove out, changing one variable at a time, you know, what works and what doesn't. If you watch my other video, the sourdough journey, the beginner mistakes and tips, I go through this entire process in detail. There are a lot more tips in there. If you are a beginner bread baker, I strongly recommend that you watch that video. And as I say at the end of that video, if you really follow the guidance that I provide in that tutorial, you can bake great bread even as a beginner. And how do I know that? Because I'm a beginner. I just started baking bread less than 3 months ago. And I keep track of all of my bakes. I keep these cheat sheets in here of every bake that I've done. I've followed the tartine recipe for about the last 8 or 9 weeks. And I've kept track of all of my bakes, including today's bake. This is exactly the 8th time I've tried this recipe. And I mean, we got 4 fantastic loaves here. So if you like what you see here and you're a beginner and you really want to learn, I thank you for watching this video, and I encourage you to watch some of my other videos. Thank you.